I have an approval?
So moved.
Okay, I have,
I'll second.
okay, there's one minor correction to be made in those minutes, and that was the date of those minutes at October 15th. It should be October 16th. So if you want to correct your copies of the minutes, that would take care of it. We're going to jump ahead of the two items in the agenda under me, and we're going to proceed right to Councilman Mike Madigan to carry on the request that we made for two alternate members to,
Yes, so it's already, we can, if we want to start posting, I know you had said you had discussed possibly waiting a little while.
yes,
If you're ready, I'll bring it up at our next workshop. I can't get it on this next agenda, but in 2 weeks I can bring it up and then we can get it posted and start the interview process.
well, I think what we should do, and I could use some help with this, is who do we want? Do we want an architect? Do we want an engineer? Do we want a building contractor? What type of expertise do we want to have to call on to assist us when that need arises?
You can request that.
You know, I think it would be beneficial to actually specify the kind of traits or some of the skill sets that we're lacking as a committee that we are really seeking, so that those people out there that may have those qualifications are applying, and those that see that that's kind of what we're looking for will know they can still apply, but less likely to possibly be a fit for what we're looking for.
Okay, well, what we have,
It's appropriate for us to say that, you know, we're lacking those skill sets and we really need them, and try and
Right.
specifically target those.
so what I'll do is I will put that together before we publish anything in the paper to get those requests. And again, we'll meet to decide of all the specialties that we're looking for, what we want to put in it, and maybe some,
Do we want to discuss it further here just right now?
okay.
I mean, let's talk about
It's fine with
what
me.
qualifications are you looking for?
I thought one was an attorney.
Yeah,
Okay, so legal.
Architect was one.
One of the issues, I think, for one of the reasons for asking for an attorney is that if we want to search records, for instance, there's nobody in this room that I'm aware of who has the qualifications or the knowledge for using, I certainly don't, for using Erie County records, which is where Jody and I have figured out we are going to have to go, because the town doesn't have the records we need for the 1800s. So we would need someone who has expertise in looking for those records with Erie County. So that would be one reason for doing it. Also, I would think in the future, if there is a property that we want to save and there's any issue about this that would require legal expertise, it would be another reason for having an attorney, even if that person isn't on the board full time, but someone who would just agree to be a resource person for the board.
And I know what that entails, because when we did that, trying to get a copy of the deed for the property in River Lee, I went down to City Hall, and the guy said, well, you can go in there, but he said, you're going to get lost.
Yeah,
He said, you would never know what to do. He said, you need a lawyer familiar with this. So Mark Frenzel's partner did the work for us, and he got the copy. So I agree, we need somebody with that kind of expertise to help us. It's not just go there and look up 123 Main Street and find the file there. My God, it's unbelievable to see the records, and you really have to know your way around. Okay, so we got an attorney, and I suggested an architect.
There was also a recommendation by Preservation Buffalo Niagara that an architect be one of the people that we should get.
Obviously someone with a passion for history.
Yes,
Yep.
exactly.
So that takes care of the two we're looking for then.
Yeah.
An attorney and an architect.
And I think stating with a passion for history is critical, because that
That's
would be
few enough
obviously-
words that we can definitely get that in the posting.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can put that in the ad, and so I'll take that action to bring that up at the next workshop to get it posted
Okay.
right after that.
Great.
And then I'll put something together, Mike, and get together with you and see if that's okay for publish. And you can take it from there, okay?
Okay. Yep.
Is there anything else anybody wants to discuss on that subject? If not, we'll move on to the next thing. Mike, we had asked you to look into the future funding budget to establish monies for future projects that are gonna be coming along the way, such
Yeah.
as tapes, recordings, and things of that nature. We most certainly can't do it with the budget that's set up for us now.
Yeah. So, I mean, here's the problem. Our sales taxes are down, I don't know what percent, but it's pretty significant. We're really, really pressed because we want to stay below the 2% tax cap as well. We have 1,000. We haven't really used that 1,000 this year, which I'm sure that the virus is part of the reason for that. But it's going to be really tough to get, if we have some specific needs, you know, we need this X, Y, Z, then probably I could justify it if it exceeds the $1,000 budget that we currently have. But even a few thousand, because to stay under the cap, I believe it's somewhere around, it's less than 200,000 total. So even when you're talking $1,000 or $2,000, you're talking 1 or 2% of the total budget that has to include raises and, you know, new vehicles and a lot of other things. So we're in probably the tightest situation we've been in.
I have a,
But if you do have some specific needs, especially if it's going to exceed $1,000, then let's put them out there, and now's the time to do it.
Well, I don't think we have a plan of what we want to do, so there's no point in buying equipment until you have the plan. And then I think we could ask the Historical Society, we could ask other people if they have the equipment that we could borrow. I mean, so it's not like we have to do this, spend money immediately. June gave me something yesterday or 2 days ago for the historian office, and I don't even know what it is, but it looks like something you plug in
Oh, yeah.
and you put tapes or something
Supposed to
to,
transfer DVDs
Oh.
onto CDs, I believe, so.
so I got a piece of machinery,
truth
but
be
we
known,
have to.
DVD to CD, and CDs are going out of style even
Well,
now.
that's the thing.
Yep.
But if you can put in a CD, then you can put it on a flash drive, so it's
Yeah.
a matter of, you know.
Nice.
it's incremental.
And I don't even know if it'll work, quite honestly, it's been in my house for so long that I thought if we could use it, I
Right.
would
And then
donate it.
there's people that have the VCR things that go to something, and then, because I know we have a few in the historian files, there's a few VCR tapes, and then I know there's quite a few at the Historical Society Library.
Mhm.
So I think we have to look into this and find out what there is, what we want to do with it before we buy stuff.
And there is the general fund. So even if it's not budgeted for, it's something we truly need. If we can make a good business case for it, we might be able to pull it out of the general fund balance, which is, you know, where that type of funds would come
Okay.
from.
We understand.
Or we do a little bit at a time. I mean, $1,000 might go a little ways towards what we're trying to achieve, so.
Okay. The next subject, Mike, I thought we put this to rest at our last meeting, but regarding Kelly's
Yeah,
country store.
so I already talked to him. He knows really no grant money is available at this time for anything associated with renovating the schoolhouse and
So it's just gonna sit there.
unless, of course, he invests in it. It's his property at this point.
It's his.
And we did, I mean, Bernie Rotella, the grant writer, did look at the public-private straddle is very tough. And at this point in time, it's probably not available.
Well, I hope the cupola makes it to next spring.
Would it be something that we take our funding and go there with a couple cans of real thick paint and just paint it and hope for the best, or buy a tarp and put a tarp over it? I mean, is that something we do on our own? I don't think they would care. But,
it's still private property. Should we go and help somebody on private property?
well, if we want it to last over the
I know,
winter,
I agree, but is that gonna be a conflict of?
I don't know. I know the town can't put $5,000 into it being private property, but I believe, you know,
A good Samaritan.
yeah, like
Right.
donate
Yeah, donate.
some paint or
your
donate the
time.
money. We could go to Guys Lumber and say, hey,
How about the Boy
You know-
Scouts? You think if some kid wants to work on a project, Eagle Scout project or something?
You
But
know,
I
with the
think, Joe-
virus too, right now, it's even tough to do that type of stuff. We tried to do BOCES for our
Gazebo.
gazebo, and that they just are not able to do it in a safe way, I guess. So I doubt they could do this in a safe
Even though they
way.
built the last gazebo?
Well,
It's
they
COVID.
can't do it safe because of the virus.
Oh, okay.
I think we'd be better off asking them about something like a tarp, because if you put paint on that wood and the paint is, or the wood is already rotting out,
yeah,
it's not gonna really do any good.
And this is beyond the Boy Scout
Yeah.
Eagle project. I
You
mean,
know,
it
months
needs
ago,
engineering, it
I
needs,
had the
you know,
name and
Right.
phone number, I don't know if I still have it, of an architect that was recommended to me, but we didn't go forward with it.
We
But-
did have an architect look at it. That was an architect, right? Who was that gentleman that we
No, he
had?
was a carpenter.
Carpenter. So,
Yeah, and see, I was looking at it from the perspective of an architect who actually deals with historical properties and
Yes.
things, and I was given this by somebody who does that kind of work, and said maybe he would volunteer to come out and take a look at it. Now, I don't even know if I could find his phone number again, to tell you the truth, but
but then we don't have any money to do anything. If the guy says, oh yeah, we could do this, this, and this, and it's gonna be $10,000, well, it's not happening.
well, that's right. But at least we'd know, and I mean, I think that would help us to make some
Well, we got
decisions
an
about
estimate for
what
the-
are our
Joe's
priorities. at
friend
this
gave
point.
the estimate,
You know,
the carpenter
Yeah.
guy gave an estimate.
And that was a lot of money.
yeah,
But what do we,
I know. And then if you tarp it, you don't wanna seal it up, because
No.
that just encourages
Yeah.
rot, but
yeah,
you
it'll
know,
get
a
moisture
cover
and everything else, you know.
where air could, I don't know, I
Probably
honestly-
almost better to be open to the air, because then it at least dries, you know. You put a tarp and then you're gonna get humidity and dripping
Pockets of
water and might accelerate it may make it
Yeah.
worse.
so we pray.
You just
Or
wish
you
they
get a
could
very
pull it
good,
into a
Barn
somewhere,
or something.
yeah, exactly, a garage barn, even, you know, back of the schoolhouse.
I wonder if there's room at the highway.
No, there's room nowhere.
Plus, that's private, and if you're gonna
Yeah.
do that, then you've gotta be able to offer that to everybody,
That's true
Yeah.
too.
Okay,
so.
We need a
it's-
good,
it's a tough one.
Charitable person to, or several to contribute to the cause, you know?
Right. Or if you knew someone who had a place to put it under a roof,
well, they got a big barn back there.
well, that's, you know, if we could have that conversation with Kevin Kelly and say, could you at least roll, is it on, it's on a
It's on a
trailer
pallet.
Yeah,
or a
they could,
pallet, so
yes, on a
scoop it
pallet.
up and go park it under a roof, just so that the snow isn't
In a barn or a warehouse or something like that, somebody
Yeah,
might have
there's
some
a
space.
barn back there, private. No, private thing. Is anyone able to talk to Kevin about that, or is that not?
I mean, I could knock on the store door, buy a couple pieces of candy and say, hey, by the way, could you store that in the barn in the back?
Yeah, if you can do that,
I
that'd be
was
great.
just in there the other day and bought a bunch of candy.
I know, I'm feeling the same way, but yeah, or if we all
I
mentioned.
can use
it
that
next time
as
we-
an excuse to go there for some of that good
Yeah.
candy.
Yes.
What if he has the equipment to move it? He needs a lift truck and pallets to move it.
We can help him with that. I mean, Dick has moved it before, so, I mean, if he says, yeah, if you can get it moved, then,
Yeah, and if, especially if there's a barn back there, I'm not that familiar with the area. but
He's got a big storage
we're gonna-
area. It kind of goes out from the building.
Oh, I think.
I've heard in the past that it's full to the brim, but
Oh,
who
yeah.
knows?
Mhm.
I'll scope that out first.
Okay.
But I'll still go for the candy.
And Mike will check it out.
Hey, Les,
Okay, we'll conclude the
got my
discussion on,
sweet tooth. They said I have to go there.
it appears there really isn't anything that we can do to, number one, retain it as ours, or do anything to repair it as theirs. It looks like just a no-go anyway. you look at it.
at this point. There's not much, I mean, the best thing we could do is if some kind of a fundraiser of some kind, you know?
And that's a shame because that is truly Grand Island historic.
Yep.
Both of them.
Yep.
That's what's a shame. We don't have much more.
Well, if we can't find somebody else to take all of the leftovers from the garage sale, or the lawn sale for the society, historical society, maybe Kelly's would be willing to have a sale on their property if the proceeds went to help restore the cupola
That's a
or
thought.
the schoolhouse.
But you know who's gonna be doing it?
Yeah.
We've already carried that stuff
Right
from
here.
That's why I really wanted somebody else to load it up, move it up, but we could,
Yeah,
I
that's a
could, I
thought.
could garner up some
Get
energy
some
for one
people
more
that-
time.
Was that successful?
Very.
Was it? Good. I was out of
Joe,
time.
we need to move along because this
Okay.
is.
All right, well, we'll conclude
Oh.
that.
So
on-
this
Actually-
is coming off the agenda, right?
Actually, I'm
Pardon?
This is
letting
coming off the agenda.
her
We're not
into the
gonna keep
room here.
cupola On the agenda.
We'll
Christina.
leave it off.
Take it off,
Yeah.
exactly, good.
Christina, can you hear us?
Yes, it's actually Christiana.
Christiana.
Yeah.
Christiana, sorry, I read it quickly.
No, it's all good.
So Christiana, just so you know, we're just finishing up an earlier meeting and then we'll bring you into the conversation, so.
Okay.
Should I quickly go through my items?
Yeah. Let's do that so we can get over because otherwise we
Okay,
have to leave by
yeah.
3.
I thought
so
we were going
nobody's gonna
directly
be
into
on
that.
time.
We
have a lot
of time.
Jody, go ahead.
Jody, first I
Okay.
want to apologize for spelling your name wrong.
Oh, that's okay.
Okay, if you want to go through quickly until can you do it in 5 minutes?
I can, or less. The new storage office at the Nike base is coming along. June has brought me some supplies that were in her office space at home. Mary and Jeff Cook donated a copier printer,
Nice.
which is cool. So it's coming along. Second, the Excel sheet, my
Can we
thought with
just go
that,
back to,
okay,
can we give it a name? How do we refer to it?
It's the town
It's the town historian
historian's
office
office.
at the Nike base.
Okay,
Senior center isn't appropriate, Nike
Right.
base is.
historian's office at.
Or, well, historian's office, I do have 16 locations.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
If someone doesn't know that it's at the Nike base, we can add that, but that's the
Oh, that's
historian
funny.
office. Oh, it's Monday. That's funny.
go ahead, Judy.
The Excel thing, I've been thinking about it, and at first when I heard it, I'm like, are you crazy? You know, that's a lot of work. But then when I was trying to like break it down, my thought is that the list of files, like that's done at the Historical Society already. You have a sheet of paper and I can do that at the historian files. And then we could put those two on a spreadsheet. So there's an A miscellaneous. There's A for Aquest Development. There's A for, it's actually Lewis F. Allen / Riverly. This is what I just looked at A yesterday at my office. So I think that can be done very easily. And then we would have this list on an Excel file of, we have these files, this is the information, and this is where it's located. And
Okay.
start there.
Okay, it's a
Does that
start.
sound-
That's great, that's a start.
Okay.
Almost like an inventory, like
Yes.
what do we have?
So when people are asking, where can I go find this information? Oh, you can find it here, or you can find it here. Or,
And the person there has a somewhat good chance of being able to actually get the file out of a
right,
bin or a file drawer or something.
exactly.
Good.
The garden club met with Frances, and she is going to go through 4 boxes and try to take out the really good stuff and put it in a file for me. I have a couple scrapbooks, 2 from Sidway, 2 from Kegabine, that I want your opinion on. Should we donate those to the school? Because there is no room to put these scrapbooks in the town files. So my thought was give them to the school to put it in their history.
Okay,
And I wondered what you guys thought of that. They're scrapbooks starting with their
Yeah.
project.
great.
Could they be scanned before we give them to them? So that there would be at least some record of it in the historical files?
Maybe.
Now that you have a
You
scanner.
feel like
In
scanning?
other words,
Yeah, it's the time. I mean, it's time.
I mean, I'll show you them. The next meeting, I'll bring them in. I had my hands full today. I'll bring them in. I'll show them to you. I don't know if they need to be scanned. I mean, you could do a project. It started here, ended here. Here's the picture. I don't think you need every, no,
You just do it by
50
page.
pages,
Oh.
50 pages per.
Per project.
I
Yeah,
think
and they were
on
probably
these-
applying for an
Okay.
award or reporting their work, and it was much more detailed than the average historical reference would require. It's a garden club project.
So we need to keep moving.
Okay, we're good.
okay.
Anything else on your list,
I think
Joe?
we wrap up very quickly the researching of the houses that we're going to do with Shirley and
That's not happening yet.
not done yet. Okay,
The other-
okay, we're done. We
That's
can
everything?
proceed on with,
Okay, Christiana,
Hi,
Christiana.
Christy's good.
Christy, that's helpful. Thank you. And I believe you can just take control. If you could, try and share your screen if that's what you wanted.
Excellent. Perfecto. Excellent.
Okay,
Turn
so
the sound up at all, Mike.
I will turn the sound up. And let's see here. Hopefully there's a volume on this one. Yep, we got. Okay, the floor is yours, Chris.
Excellent. Thank you. I can't see any of your faces, but it's lovely to meet you. Again, I am Christiana Libniadis. Christy is perfectly fine. I'm the director. Thank you. The director.
Everybody wave.
Hello. I am the Director of Preservation Services for Preservation Buffalo Niagara. So thank you so very much for, from June reaching out to me and us having our conversations, and for you guys taking that initiative to get training so that you can do your job to the best of your ability. As I'm sure June has talked with you guys already about, this first session is really kind of a basic introductory level, just going over Preservation 101, making sure that we're all on the same page about various key terms and processes, so that as you continue with your meetings and in your important work, and certainly as we continue with further trainings, we know we all have that same base level understanding of materials. For those of you who are new to hearing who Preservation Buffalo Niagara is, we are your local advocacy organization. We are a nonprofit organization. Our mission is to identify, protect, and promote our unique architecture and historic legacy, and to connect the people to the places that they love in Western New York. Our name does have Buffalo and Niagara in it, but our actual service area is much broader than those areas. We provide services to the 5 westernmost counties of New York State. So a very large service area with a very broad mission of just identifying, protecting, and promoting. How we usually divide up that work, just so that you have a better understanding of who we are and how we work, we divide it up into 4 general categories. So education, technical service, advocacy, and then community development. Education, whether it's in person or virtually, we have lectures and workshops all the time, highlighting various architectural history elements and topics, or technical topics, again, giving homeowners and community owners the information they need to better understand and appreciate their historic built environment, so then they can then better protect and promote their historic resources. Technical service, you can always pick up the phone or shoot an email to us at PBN and asking any types of questions you have about preservation, whether it is a materiality kind of question. How do you fix this? How do you find this? to take care of your property, or preservation planning questions, like when we started talking and questions about your ordinance and questions about what you're doing. If you need help as a municipality or as an individual citizen, help with landmark nominations or National Register nominations or historic tax credits, we are here to provide that assistance. And then advocacy and community development are basically the same thing. Advocacy is where we are taking that lead in that fight. So we are taking the lead in advocating to preserve something, to landmark something, for legislation that will support preservation efforts. And then community development right now is an example of that community development, where we come into your community and give you the tools and tips that you need to be in charge of your preservation destiny. Again, we have a 5-county service area, so we cannot be at every meeting or in front of every bulldozer or wrecking ball. So making sure that you know what preservation is and how to move forward, or at least a better understanding, then that's incredibly important to us. And when I say us, just want to introduce everybody else, since because of pandemic situations, you might not see everyone's face that as often as we would in person. So our executive director is Jessie Fisher, there I am, and then Mary, Tia, Tabitha, and Bridge round out the group. All right, let us get into actual topics about Preservation 101. So today's workshop, what we're going to talk about, is going to be divided into 3 main categories. So first, we're going to talk about a whole slew of different terms and policies and legislations that affect and drive doing preservation. And then we're going to quickly kind of go over the different types of designations that we have. You guys are obviously already familiar with local landmarking, but we'll also talk about the National Register. And then we'll briefly kind of go through those general reasons why we do preservation, so that we have a better understanding and start kind of collecting those good elevator speech and little factoids that you can help articulate to people who might not understand preservation, why they should want to do preservation. And let's just get into it. So what is historic preservation? In that green box there, you see a perfectly lovely definition by the National Park Service that uses the word we're defining in the definition. So that's always incredibly helpful. Essentially, what preservation is when a community identifies what is significant and important to them in their built environment or natural environment, and they choose to take steps to ensure that that resource is there for future generations. Ultimately, that's what this is about. It's about identifying what we value and find significant, and taking the steps to retain those elements as part of our built environment. When we talk about preservation, because the term actually has the word history and historic in it, it's so easy, and so much of our conversations focus on that culture and that architecture and the history aspect of why we do preservation. But it's very, very important to understand that it's not just about preserving our culture and about sustainability of our culture. It's also about preserving and sustainability of our environment and our economy. It is completely connected to all of those topics. I think some people who do not see or understand the value of preservation just think of it as we want to make things look the way we want them to make. But it's not just about those elements. It's about recycling and keeping and being as green as possible and being as financially sustainable as well. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what those things mean at the end, kind of when we talk about the benefits, and go over a little bit more detail, the environmental and economic reasons for preservation. It's also really, really important to understand that when we talk about preservation, this is not new. I think a lot of naysayers and people that you have had in your hearings, I'm sure, or people who have newly purchased a landmark building and didn't realize that it was landmark. They're just like, where did this come from? This is brand new. I've never heard of this before. But we have been doing historic preservation in some capacity under some sort of terminology since the beginning of our nation. So you can see here a very annotated, very, very brief timeline of some key moments in preservation history. The first being at the beginning of the forming of our country in 1816. What we now know as Independence Hall was privately owned. The owner did not want the building anymore and was about to start demolishing it. And the citizens of the community and the municipality organized and tried to get him not to tear down that building. They were obviously successful. And we now have Independence Hall, which is one of the most important national landmarks that we have, one of the top visited landmarks that we have. I can't imagine Philadelphia without that building. I can't imagine our discussion about our early founding of our country without that building. And that could have very easily have been lost to us. I also love to bring up in 1850 how we in New York State are the first government agency in this land to purposefully buy a property because of its history. So in 1850, New York State buys Washington's headquarters in Newburgh. It's the headquarters that Washington occupied the longest during the Revolutionary War. New York State buys it, and since 1850 has owned it and operated it in some sort of version of a commemorative space, historic museum, historic site. So we have that to be proud of. We, very forefront of preservation there. Many, many things happen throughout all of those years, whether it is a community-driven aspect or something as part of legislation and a municipal decision. It all culminates with the 1966 National Historic Preservation Act. The film reel on the side is LBJ signing that. And it was actually the anniversary of signing that document, I think yesterday or the day before. So we had a little birthday celebration for that. This is the legislation that sets it as federal policy for preservation. Everything that we do in preservation today, everything that you do in your commission trainings, it all stems from this legislation. So it's really important to understand what that legislation enables and how it created that framework. I will say, in a goofy side note, this film reel of LBJ, I continuously add it and keep it in this presentation that I give, because almost every time, I don't think that's going to happen with today's group, but I almost always have somebody in the audience, a younger person, make some sort of goofy comment about who's that weirdo lady in the background, and I quickly correct them that it is lovely Lady Bird Johnson, who was a fan of preservation, and that we should all remember and know who she is. All right, so let's talk about our National Preservation Act. Again, it recognizes that it is necessary and appropriate for the federal government to accelerate its historic preservation program. So it makes this part of our federal mission and part of our responsibility on the federal government to do this work, to facilitate this work. It's been updated and amended and continued over the years. So there have been things added to it. But the major things that are created from this act are these 5 aspects. It establishes the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. It establishes and requires the Section 106 review process. It establishes the National Register of Historic Places, the National Historic Landmark Program, and then the state historic preservation offices. It requires each state to create one of those preservation offices. We will now discuss what those aspects are. And obviously scream and yell if there are any questions or if I'm talking too fast or anything like that. All right, so the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, it is an independent federal agency that promotes preservation. So just like the FCC or the FDA, they work in their own regards to do policies in their own fields, but they're part of the federal government still. So this council provides guidance on the federal level to Congress and the president on preservation policy. We see here these bullet points below, these 4 main bullet points. There's actually 5 key things that the ACHP is in charge of. So first and foremost is being that liaison to federal agencies and elected officials to guide them and advise them in how to do preservation. As the tip-top agency for preservation in the country, they are then also in charge in supervising preservation initiatives. So they conduct many, many surveys on their own and draft example policies to promote the benefits of historic preservation. They also assist at a state level when states are undergoing those same types of research projects and policy development. If you go to the ACHP's website, you can find a landing page that lets you access every single report that has ever been done by the states on how preservation is done in their state or how it impacts their state. So if you're ever looking for a financial impact of preservation report, the ACHP is the easiest place to go and find that report for your state. It then also does communications and education and outreach. I've actually taken several classes with this ACHP to better understand some of their programs that they run and other matters. So they have programs that are available not just for professionals, for professional development, but also for the general public. And then they are also the ones that take the lead on the advocacy and communication to indigenous tribes in America and the issues that relate to land management with indigenous and approved Native American tribes. Their fifth major responsibility and what they are in charge of is the Section 106 review. So let's learn what that is. I think we've all kind of heard this in passing, and I'm sure in your work in the commission and the municipality, you've definitely heard about Section 106. It is the required review process for federally funded projects so that they can identify where historic resources are and how their actions might impact those resources. So that whole entire process is within the duty of ACHP. They are the top administrator of that program. Obviously, each individual Section 106 review happens on the state level, in your community. But if there are issues and it has to get elevated or bumped up or it's challenged or whatnot, it ultimately goes back to the ACHP for guidance and advice. Here you see just kind of that rough timeline explaining what the Section 106 process is. I think ultimately the biggest thing that you need to know, the most important thing to know about the Section 106 review is that the review is required. So if they're going to impact historic resources, they need to do this review, but they are not required to follow the recommendations that come out of that review. So for example, you have a community and the Department of Transportation decides that they have to put their new highway through that community. Obviously, if they're tearing down historic resources to build that highway, they are impacting historic resources and it would trigger a Section 106 review. If they're tearing down buildings to build a highway, they obviously are impacting those. And so it would negatively impact. And the advice would be to move the highway, right? That would be the number one recommendation out of this review. But they don't have to do that. So on one hand, I can see how we say that this process is useless and it doesn't do anything because it actually doesn't protect any resources. But at the other hand, it is just another way that the community and stakeholders have an opportunity to voice their opinion and try to move the conversation on those. I think more often than not, Section 106 reviews actually do end up with alterations and modifications to project plans so that it does impact historic resources less than maybe the original plans were. When I was saying how the ACHP does education and outreach, the majority of their education and outreach is about Section 106. So you see here on the side, the cover of their citizen guide to Section 106 review, and the courses that I've taken with ACHP have all been, next level explaining Section 106 review and giving me as a professional the tools I need to do that more as successfully as possible. It also created, the National Preservation Act created the National Register of Historic Places, the NRHP, if you want to say all the letters, but I'm sure that you guys are already calling it this way, just simply calling it the NR is perfectly fine. It is the federal government's official list of historic resources deemed worthy for preservation because of their historical significance. So that's really important to understand and the nuance of that sentence, that it's not just an official list of our historic resources. It's not just gold star, you're historic. It's that you have this significance that we value And it's such, we value it so much that you're worthy of preservation. We want to retain this resource. And why it's important to understand that difference is that there are many resources out there that have immense significance, that do meet the eligibility requirements on the significance side for the National Register, but they might not have the integrity that worthy of preservation. If there are no character defining features on that resource that relate to why it's significant, then it might not actually be eligible for the National Register because there isn't anything worthy of preservation. I think right now, in this moment in time that we find ourselves, there's a lot of conversations happening in the professional world about changing and tweaking that definition to take away so much emphasis on that integrity aspect of it. But as of right now, that is how the policy is written. That is how we've been executing these this policy. So we need to just be mindful of that. It definitely needs to have some work on it as we move into the future, but that's how it is and operating at this time. As you see, since its inception, there have been more than 95,000 resources listed on the in the National Register. And when we say resources, when we talk about preservation, almost all of your landmarks that you have and the COAs that you come into you for review are going to be about buildings. But technically, when we're doing preservation, we're not talking about buildings, we're talking about resources. And so resources can be a building, it can be a structure, it can be objects, it can be sites, whether they are man-made sites or naturally made sites. And then historic districts are individual resources. So if we, understand that all the different types of things that we can nominate, when we look back at that 95,000 resource number, that actually turns into infinitely more than just 95,000 things on the National Register, right? So if you have a historic district, that's one resource, but that historic district has 200 houses in it, and all of those houses are listed on the National Register as part of that district. So that there are a significant amount of properties and resources on the list. And it is operated by the National Park Service. At the top, they are in charge of the National Register. There's actually a staff person. Their title is the keeper of the register, and it's their job to maintain the National Register and to maintain that paperwork. I aspire to have that job just because of the name keeper, because that would just look real cool on a business card, I think. But the actual day-to-day, the majority of that review and development of these National Register nominations is done at the state level, at the community level, and it's operated by those state historic preservation offices, which we'll talk about in a second. The National Historic Landmarks Program, NHL. This is one of my biggest pet peeves when I'm walking around and using that phrase, oh, it's a national landmark. If you're listed in the National Register, you're not a national landmark. National landmarks, as you see here, is a specific program that is that nominates and designates places that hold very significant national level significance. So these are places that critically impacted and directed the development of our nation. We have some examples here from Niagara County that are National Historic Landmarks. So the power plant, Fort Niagara, and then Niagara Falls itself is a National Historic Landmark. You have to be careful about that term. And so if we look at how many sites reach this tip-top level of importance, we're only about 2,000, almost, I think we're probably a little bit closer to 3,000 now, but not too much higher than 2,600 that we have that last number that they quoted. So it is a smaller group. You get nominated to the National Register, and then once you're listed to the National Register, the National Park Service staff reviews those nominations to see if any of them might be elevated to this next level up. And then we're back to the state historic preservation offices. So the National Preservation Act recognizes that, like with many other functions of the federal government, there is no way that that federal level agency can actually do all the work that this legislation says and expects to be done. So in this legislation, they require that each of the states have to have their own preservation office so that they are the gatekeepers to get information to the National Park Service. You can't really pick up the phone and just call the National Park Service to talk about a National Register nomination. You have to go through your individual state preservation offices. Each state operates that office differently. It forms it differently, has it in different locations in their umbrella of government agencies. Here in New York State, as you can see by the little chart, and as I'm sure you guys are aware already, our state office is located within the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, which then simples down to the Division of Historic Preservation. So technically, our SHPO is the Division for Historic Preservation, but nobody actually calls it that in practice. We all just call it SHPO. When we're talking to our SHPO representatives and working with SHPO, it is helpful to understand how they internally divide their work and employees up. So there is a Technical Preservation Services unit, a Bureau of Historic Sites, and then the Community Preservation Services. So Technical Preservation Services are going to be the archaeology unit, and then the units that do the maintenance and security to their own, the department, the SHPO owned resources and materials. So the kind of the getting the dirt people are in that office. The Bureau for Historic Sites, these are the people that work within those historic sites, right? So it's the conservation units, the collection units, the curatorial units, the interpretive staffs, all of the people that make that historic site function are going to be within that department. And then for our purposes, from an HPC point of view, from a commission point of view, the majority of your interaction, if there is interaction with SHPO, is going to be through that Community Preservation Services office. So that is where we have the survey and evaluation unit. So when you hire a consultant to do a historic resource survey of your community, it's that department that your consultant is going to communicate with to do that project. If you are deciding to nominate something to the National Register, it's within that department as well that you would be communicating and working through that process. And again, just kind of taking a step back to understand the hierarchy of the different organizations that do work in preservation. So we have our public side and our private side. So the public side is going to be those governmental agencies that regulate preservation. So again, like I was saying, in the National Preservation Act, understanding that the National Park Service, that national group, could not handle all of the work to be done, they required those state preservation offices to be that middleman between the communities. And then at that bottom level, at the local level, we have organizations like you, communities that have taken that step to recognize that they value preservation and they value their historic resources and want to preserve them for future generations, enact preservation ordinances and create these preservation commissions. So we have that hierarchy on that public side, which is then matched with the same kind of hierarchy on the private side. Nonprofit organizations is the majority of what we're talking about on the private side, but also keep in mind that private consultants and other for-profit preservation groups are going to be considered on this side as well. We, PBN, are your local preservation advocacy group. So we are your nonprofit partner in doing preservation here in our local communities. At the state level, we have the Preservation League of New York State, and then at the federal level, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It's actually interesting to, just a side note to understand that the National Trust for Historic Preservation, when it was originally created, the idea was that that organization was going to eventually turn into a government agency that operates and completed the preservation policies for the nation. That is how England structures their preservation policy, that they have a national trust that is a hybrid governmental agency and nonprofit organization, and they operate the preservation policy. But here in America, that paradigm just didn't fit for us. And so by the time we get to 1966, we see the National Trust shifting into a solely nonprofit role. Last thing I'll say on this slide, when we come to preservation organizations, nonprofit organizations to reach out to for assistance, whether you are a municipality or a private citizen, there are these overreaching, general nonprofit advocacy organizations that I list on the screen, but there are also many, many niche group preservation organizations out there. So there is a New York State Barn Coalition, and they only provide services about barns. There are modern architecture organizations. There are organizations that just deal with certain architects. The Frank Lloyd Wright Trust, they only deal with Frank Lloyd Wright stuff. So there are, in addition to these umbrella organizations, many, many other organizations that you can reach out to for assistance and advice, depending on your topic. All right, any questions about the National Preservation Act or any of those things that I just discussed? Awesome. Okay. So next we're going to talk about the 4 approaches to the treatment of historic properties. When we are just casually conversing about preservation projects and about doing work on our built environment, we often interchangeably use the words preserve, rehab, restore. I'm preserving it, I'm rehabbing it, restoring it. That's fine in regular conversation, but it's incredibly important to understand that when we are talking in preservation planning situation, these are distinct but related different approaches to treat historic properties. So you can preserve it, you can rehab it, you can restore it, you can reconstruct it. Let's unpack that for a second. Sorry, I forgot this was the next slide. So these approaches and the different treatments and approaches for historic properties was developed by the National Park Service. They established these back in the 1970s after the National Preservation Act was initiated and the state preservation offices were starting to be formed, and the National Park Service was really, getting into high gear on getting these policies and handbooks and manuals out to the communities to use. So they established what is called the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Historic Preservation. So there are Secretary of the Interior standards for each of those 4 approaches. They used to print and distribute widely books that explain what those standards and guidelines are. Now we've reached a point where this document is just too many pages that they no longer give you free copies. And so you have to access this PDF book online. It is a honkin' download if you are going to download it yourself. That's what this black covered book here is. And it includes all of the standards and all of the guidelines. And I'll explain what the difference is between the standards and the guidelines in a second, but let's go through and understand what the different treatments are. So the treatment of preservation. This is the act or process of applying measures necessary to sustain the existing form, integrity, materials of a historic property. What preservation is about is that you have a historic resource. It has the materials it has right now. It has the alterations it has right now. It's about freezing that building in time and not making substantial changes to those materials and form that we find. It's basically freezing it. You definitely are going to still make maintenance and upkeep to your property so you can keep using it, but you're not going to do things like completely rip out or replace or alter, mechanicals or other decorative elements to the exterior of building. It also means that you're not going to change the use of that building. When we talk about examples of the treatment of preservation, most homeowners who just occupy their house, they're not making big major changes every year to their property. They just repair and maintain what they currently have. You're preserving that property. The biggest kind of easier example to kind of get your head around it, I think, is when we talk about municipal buildings. So here is Buffalo City Hall. It was built as a city hall. It has been used as a city hall. It's, for all intents and purposes, always going to be used as a city hall. They've certainly made upgrades and repairs to this building, but there have never been wholesale, complete, extensive replacements of the elements of this building, decorative and mechanical. And there has been no new construction to this building. It's the building it is, just keeping it humming along, moving forward. Any questions? Excellent. Now we move on to restoration. So restoration, I think, is a little bit easier to understand and comprehend. It's the act of bringing a property back in time. So preservation is about freezing it in this moment. Restoration is about bringing it backwards in time, but not just arbitrarily bringing it backwards or what we think it might have been in the past. It is only the true following of the treatment of treatment of restoration. If you are doing this restoration process based on detailed documentation, the paramount rule for historic preservation, and when we're building and working on our resources, we do not want to fake history, right? We don't want to confuse and build something that is completely, totally modern, but looks like it's historic, because we want to make that distinction between these historic resources and our new construction. But restoration, we can bring this building back in time because we're using those original documentation, the original blueprints, the original information from the contractors. So we're not just creating something that looks old-timey and matches that building, but we're actually restoring what was originally there. As you see from the picture in front of you, the best example we have locally of that is the Darwin Martin House. They picked a moment in time to restore that building to. That moment they picked was, I think the year was 1907 or 1909. I forget the exact date, but it was when Frank Lloyd Wright stopped touching the building. So to restore that building, they removed all of the things that had been added or altered after the fact and removed those modern alterations, and they reconstructed and restored those elements that had been removed from that location. So now that they've finished this multi-year, multi-million-dollar project, it now actually, you step on that campus and it feels like Frank just finished building that building and that property. So again, the key thing for restoration is that you're bringing it back in time based on that solid documentation. Moving on to reconstruction, it is basically the same thing as restoration. It's about bringing something to a particular moment back in time, but reconstruction is when that resource does not exist. So you don't even have something that you can restore. You have to totally reconstruct it. But again, it's not just reconstructing it based on what you think it's going to look like or just a handful of images that you might have. It's based on actual documentation, blueprints, notes, information so that when you're finished reconstructing that resource, you know that it is representative and actually would have been in that moment in the past and not a reinterpretation of what that resource would be like. Here's an example of it's a blacksmith shop that is on the Buffalo Niagara Heritage Village site. And so this was not an original building that they had moved there, but one that they reconstructed based on instructions from that time period. And then that last treatment, and why it's last is because it is the treatment that you as Preservation Commission and most people that interact with preservation, it's this treatment that we're talking about, the treatment of rehabilitation. The treatment of rehabilitation is the only treatment that allows for modern change. Again, preservation is about freezing it in this current moment. Restoration and reconstruction is about going backwards in time. Rehabilitation is about finding that balance between preserving the character-defining features of that resource and allowing for changes for continued use in a modern era. Again, that's really important to understand that the point of rehabilitation, because again, especially from your point of view at the Preservation Commission, where you're reviewing people's COAs and approval for exterior changes to their property, if they are combative or don't understand what the rehabilitation is, they might be under the impression that you're going to make them bring their property backwards in time, that you're going to make them turn their house into a house museum or some other outlandish idea. But that's not true. Rehabilitation standards is all about allowing for those modern changes, but doing it in a way that is suitable and appropriate so that we can preserve those character-defining features. Here's a picture of, and they actually finished this project. I should put up a new picture of it. It was an old freight train building in North Buffalo, and they turned it into commercial spaces and I think lofts. And so, yeah, rehabilitation is not just about making those changes to the exterior and changing out those character defining features for maybe modern versions of those, but also about changing the use. So you might not have actually changed anything about the architecture or structure, but you're taking it from an industrial use and converting it to a residential use. That's a rehabilitation. So understanding it's not just the materials that you might be changing out, but also the use of that structure. When I said that there are standards and guidelines. So for each of these 4 treatments, there is a set of standards. For a lack of a better phrase, they are basically the 10 commandments of that treatment. So the standards of rehabilitation, these are the 10, ways and principles of how to do preservation. Essentially, what these 10 standards mean is that you want to retain, repair, and replace in kind. You want to retain those existing historic materials because that's why your property is significant. It's significant because of those existing character defining features. So we want to keep them. We want to repair them in a way that is as least intervention as possible. We don't want to ruin or permanently damage those items in our effort to repair them. And then if they are beyond repair, either because it is physically impossible to repair it or it is financially impossible to repair it, then in that replacement, we want to make sure that we are using an in-kind material, that our changes are as sympathetic as possible. To help guide through that and explain and make the standards a little bit more accessible, the National Park Service, in that big book that they not only offer the individual 10 standards for each treatment, but they offer guidelines. And so you see here an example of one of the pages from the guidelines on rehabilitation. They will offer you, based on those standards, what is the recommended and not recommended treatment when you're handling certain aspects. So the book is divided up by part of the building, by scope of the building. So here's the first page of the masonry section. So it tells you what's recommended to do when handling masonry and what's not recommended to do with masonry. When you're reading through these guidelines, it's important to understand that in one way they are fairly vague. They don't point blank say, yes, do this, don't do that, because everyone's building is different. Everyone's situation is different. And so we don't want to have such prescribed instructions that they're not relevant to anybody. They need to be broad enough that they can be applied to your property. And again, in applying these standards, depending on which process that you're applying it, in your case, for a local preservation commission, your law has a hardship clause to it. Most preservation ordinances do factor in hardship. So if the preservation guidelines were so specific and said you can only do this and you can never do this, those guidelines would never allow you to be able to alter those guidelines and to alter your advice to allow for maybe not the 100% preservation best practices and standards thing, but to allow for a modification of that for when it is a hardship on that property owner to follow that instruction. I think, especially here in Western New York, the most common example of how that would, when we're talking about residential architecture and homeowner occupied properties, is when we talk about slate roofs. As wonderful and long lasting as slate roofs are, they are expensive to repair and to replace. And it is a rightful, appropriate expensive cost because a slate roof can last for over 100 years. But once you've reached the end of that life, it is a pretty penny, depending on your property, to repair. And so if these guidelines were so strict that said that you could never take a slate roof off, that you would have so many homeowners left in this very uncomfortable position of not being able to get permission to maybe sub out that slate roof for another appropriate material. the PDF book that the National Park Service offers, that you can download that whole document, but they also have an incredibly user-friendly, navigatable website where you can explore each of the treatments and their standards and guidelines without downloading that huge document. I like to plug that because their old website for the standards was incredibly hard to read and navigate. It was very internet 1995, and that was in like 2010. And so now it is so much easier to navigate and accessible to everybody. Any questions about the treatments of preservation, the different treatments of historic properties? Excellent. You guys are so smart. Great job. Let us, we're going to be done in record time. So let's move on to designations, right? So obviously, as the regulatory agency at your local level, working on establishing local landmarks, you certainly are aware with these, but let's just make sure we're all on the same page about this. When we're talking about designation, whether it's on the local level or the national level, these are the four main terminologies and criteria. I don't know what word to use there, but the things that we need to pay attention to and affect how we evaluate and then designate properties. So criteria, integrity, significance, we're going to talk about on the next page. I do just want to briefly talk about age. This is a very confusing thing for a lot of us. I think that for a very long time, it has been conveyed to everybody from the top down that only resources that are 50 years or older are eligible for designation. And that's not necessarily true. What the National Preservation Act initiates, and then those early policies and legislation that was written around the National Register process and whatnot, reference this 50-year rule, not necessarily because you could not designate things that were younger than 50 years, but that because they were so recent and hadn't had that historic time to accumulate significance, you needed to use special considerations in evaluating that significance. If something is going to be significant right now, then it needs to be something that's a bit of a higher significance and larger significance than maybe something that had been from the past. It needs to really warrant that designation so early in its life. So understanding that, yes, the general rule of thumb, we try to look and consider things that are 50 or older, but that does not mean you cannot nominate things that are younger than that. And again, always keeping in mind that 50 years is a moving target. So every year that 50-year difference changes. I think that a lot of us working in the field now have always just been thinking about 50 years was in the 20s or 30s, but the 50 years is now in the 60s and 70s, is approaching there. So it's always moving closer and closer. And so we have to be mindful that we're catching up and researching and identifying those more modern resources that newly become into age of 50, so that we're not missing out on the opportunity to provide those new resources protection as well. Let us go into criteria and integrity and significance. So criteria, pretty easy word to define. It's principles or standards to evaluate the properties. So each level of designation will have their own set of criteria. So you in your local preservation ordinance list out your criteria for local landmarking. And just like the National Park Service has outlined the criteria for National Register listing. Integrity. Integrity is about the authenticity of that property's historic identity. It's not about condition, it's about the integrity of its character defining features. We're going to talk about that in the next slide a little bit more. Significance is the who, what, where, when, about what makes this resource important. It's its history, it's its culture, whatever makes this property, this resource significant. When we're talking about analyzing and identifying significance, we have to also understand that it's not just happening in its own cycle, own little bubble. because everything is connected to somebody. Everything has some sort of history connected to it. But that history that we're identifying has to then come back and connect to the broader context of history, the broader patterns of history. So how does this property affect and shape and play into the history of your community, into your state, into your nation? So it can't just be this one individual thing that this one dude just happened to do this one thing at. It has to tie back into the broader narrative of your community, of whatever institution it's associated with. It has to be tied to a broader context. Bless you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So let's come back to integrity. When we talk about integrity, the National Park Service has identified it as, defined it by using these 7 aspects. So that's location, setting, design, material, workmanship, feeling, and association. Those are in different colors because they're a little more wobbly to understand. From the National Park Service point of view and for the National Register listing, you have to retain at least 4 of these 7 aspects to be deemed of having a high enough integrity to be worthy of preservation, right? Because again, the National Register is about significant buildings worthy of preservation. So to be worthy, you have to have integrity, and integrity is defined as at least 4 of these elements. While it may not be outwardly referenced in your individual ordinance, because your ordinance references using the standards, the Secretary of the Interior standards and other best practices out there in the field, when you are doing your local landmarking, you should also factor in this level of integrity. But because it's not listed in your ordinance, you certainly on the local level have much more ability to designate things that have a low level of integrity than we have the ability to nominate those resources to the National Register. Because again, at that local level, your ordinance says that you are nominating things that are just significant. It doesn't say it has to be significant and have that integrity. But you do want to be mindful of noting integrity in your nominations on the local level. So let's just explain what these 7 aspects mean. So location, it's the location. Has it been moved? Was it built in this spot and always in that spot, or was it moved? Setting, was it originally an urban setting that has now, a busy neighborhood, and now it's no longer a busy neighborhood and it's the only house left on the block? Was it a formerly rural setting that is now no longer rural? That affects its integrity. Design, material, and workmanship are, very connected and relatable into, are those design elements, those materials, that original craftsmanship, is that still visible and present on that resource, or have they been removed? Feeling and association are a little bit more wiggly things to define. Feeling would be more akin to, you have a 19th century farmhouse that, built in the early 1800s, is completely away from all other buildings, that had, many, many different barns and a lovely little pond. Well, if all of that is gone and all that remains is that main homestead, that homestead no longer has the feeling or the association with its original construction. So that negatively impacts its integrity. There's an example here in Erie County, a very, very significant house out in Cheektowaga belonging to one of the very, key families that, first European family that settled here in Western New York, and their house, miraculously still exists. But it has been altered so much that there is really no historic fabric left in that building. And so it sort of puts everyone in this weird spot where its integrity is literally at a 0. Or 2, because the location and setting is still there, but everything else is gone. So it has no integrity. There is nothing on that building to preserve, despite having this incredibly high significance. But because that integrity is so bad, it's just not enough to be able to list that property on the National Register. Association, another example of association would be something like a train station. So you have an old original train station, a depot stop. If that train, the actual tracks have been removed, but the building is still perfectly in exact condition in every other way, it's lost that association to what made it significant. So yes, it's a depot building, but it's no longer connected to the actual train tracks that made it significant. When we talk about how you have to have 4 of the 7, when it comes to feeling and association, just the loss of feeling and association is not enough to say that it does not have integrity, because we recognize that feeling and association is a little bit more subjective than location, setting, design, material, and workmanship. Those are things that we can quantitatively, evaluate. Feeling and association is a little bit more personal opinion into it, so you cannot determine integrity solely on those 2 elements. The big thing when you talk about integrity is to be mindful that we are not talking about condition. Condition and integrity are not the same. You have these 2 pictures here on the right-hand side. That top one, again, not sure how large it is on your TV screen there, but it is in bad condition. There are basically no windows in it. Everything is boarded up. The paint's, that's like 100-year-old paint on it, and it's peeling. It's in horrible condition. But if you look at that property, you can visually see that it is it gives you that feeling and association. It has all of those design and material workmanships. You can see that it is a 19th century worker cottage that was built in the Fruit Belt. That's where it is. It's in its original setting. It has its original design. Even the alterations that have been made to it over the years are historic. They've earned their own history to it, added to the historic narrative of that property. So it's not even a negative that it's been altered, because those were such historic changes to it. So it has an incredibly high level of integrity, even though it is not livable in any sort of way. Versus that property at the bottom, it's a house in the west side of Buffalo. I know that it was built in the 1890s. It's a beautiful old historic house, but you look at it now, you don't see any of those character defining features. You have no idea, when you compare those 2 pictures, you look at the top one, you can recognize, because of that high level of integrity, what it is, possibly when it was built, what it was used for, all of those aspects. And you look at this one, and all of those character defining features have been removed. It has no feeling or association to its 19th century construction dates. So that might be in great condition and a wonderful, pretty, clean house to live in, but it has 0 integrity, basically. Any questions about that? Spectacular. All right, so now let's talk about the actual levels of designation. I got this weird hair thing happening. All right, so we have, for all intents and purposes, it is 3 different types of designations that exist. There is the National Register of Historic Places, where you can nominate individual landmarks and also historic districts. You have local level landmarking, which, as you know, you can nominate individual landmarks or also historic districts. And then there is a thing called certified local historic districts. And so this level of designation is only available to historic districts. You cannot certify an individual resource. And we'll explain what that means in a second. What you don't see on this screen, but that does exist, is the state level register. So every state has their own state register. The New York State Register of Historic Places is a real thing. But here in New York, compared to other states in the country, our process to nominate to the state register is built into the process of nominating to the national register. So here in New York, it is kind of a streamlined process. You work with your state preservation office staff person to craft and draft that nomination. That nomination is accepted by the preservation office. It's reviewed by the state. They determine if it's eligible, determine whether or not to add it to the state register. If they do add it to the state register, then they send it on to the National Park Service. If you are doing preservation in other communities, in other states, Many states have those processes completely separated. So you fill out one application form for the state register and you file another application form for the national register. So just being mindful of that, because when you're looking at resources online, they might be written generally for the whole nation and not necessarily pertaining to the specific way that we here in New York operate this process. All right, let's talk about the different designation levels. So National Register of Historic Places, it was enabled, as we covered earlier, enabled by the National Preservation Act of 1966, and it's our federal government's official list of those individual resources worthy of preservation for their historic significance. It is a honorary designation only. Honorary designation only. If you get listed on the National Register, the federal government cannot and will not voice any sort of opinion or regulatory aspect on what you do with your property. If you are listed on the National Register and only the National Register, you as the Preservation Commission have no purview over regulating that process. It is solely an honorary designation. Where a possible regulatory aspect comes in is when we talk about financial incentives. So being listed on the National Register of Historic Places is the gateway for historic preservation related financial incentives. So that could be historic tax credits for for-profit property owners, or that is grant opportunities for nonprofit property owners. That's a lot of P words right there. So to be eligible for those things, you have to be listed on the National Register. And then if you are getting money to do your preservation project, if the federal government or the state government is going to give you money, then they're going to want to make sure that you are following preservation standards and guidelines. So that's where you would have a regulatory aspect to a resource that's listed on the National Register. But if you don't want the state or federal government to tell you what to do with your property, then you don't need to pursue those financial incentives, but they are there if you are interested in them. The National Register is an important land use tool. I think it's a lot, we talk about it more and understand it better when we're talking about transportation, or we're talking about the environment, to do studies and surveys of how our actions will affect our natural environment or our road. We're not going to change a road before we do a study to see how that change might impact it. The work that's necessary, the survey work that's necessary to do a National Register nomination gives you this wealth of information about your historic built environment. Whether or not you do go on to do a National Register nomination is certainly up to your discretion as the property owner, as the community members. But even just doing that survey work that could lead to a National Register nomination gives you all of that information. And it's important and beneficial to a community, no matter what their status of a preservation policy on a local level is. Again, no municipality is going to take a step to alter their rivers or their lakes or their roadways without doing a study. Wouldn't it be smart to do a study of our historic built environment before we take drastic changes to alter that historic built environment? I think the connection between the fact that we use our buildings to pay our property taxes, which then pay for our municipality, and then we allow such drastic changes to happen to those properties without factoring in the broader implications and effects that those actions would take. Last thing, and almost the most important thing to remember about the National Register is that it does require owner approval. It's sort of, on one hand, stupid to have a requirement for owner approval because, again, there's no regulatory function to it. There's no way that this impacts your ability to use and enjoy your property in any way. But because it is an action by the federal government, it was written into the law that you require permission to be listed. So that means that if we're talking about an individual resource, that individual property owner needs to say okay to the National Register nomination. If we're talking about creating a whole historic district, they don't go door to door and ask, do you say yes or no, check this box, but they open the process up to public input. And if they get an overwhelming negative response to establishing that historic district, then SHPO and the National Park Service will not go forward with that historic district. That's why when it comes to National Register nominations creation, it's really key to do your due diligence as that individual or organization pursuing that nomination to make sure, especially with historic districts, that you are doing that outreach and education so that they better understand the implication and effect that this will have, which is really no implication or effect onto people, so that they're not reacting unnecessarily or reacting to inappropriate information or wrong information about what a National Register nomination would do to them. And then shifting to local landmarking now. Any questions about the National Register? Awesome. So now local landmarking. Again, you guys are your Historic Preservation Commission, so you should be very, very familiar with how this process works. But again, to be able to locally landmark individual resources or historic districts, you have to have a law on your books that allows for that. So you have to have a preservation ordinance, and that would be your primary law that acts to protect and preserve a community's historic resources. This is where we have regulation. This is the strongest form of legal protection for historic properties. Each ordinance is going to be written by that community, tailored to fit their needs and their resources. So not every single landmark nomination ordinance is going to be the same. Here in New York State, the State Preservation Office and the SHPO office do have a model example, an example legislation, so that communities who are looking to adopt preservation ordinance have that kind of guideline and guidance to start drafting that. But you don't have to follow what they say in that model. You can make it however you wish to have it, and to be as strict as you want or as loose as you want. It is your law to tailor how you want. But essentially, all landmark ordinances in some way follow these key things. So you have a local preservation ordinance. It is honorary and regulatory. So yes, it is a gold star. Congratulations, you are significant to our community, to the state history, to the national history, whatever your significance is. Yay, 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 good job, you're historic. But then, because we have the significance, we will then have that regulatory aspect. And for 99% of the landmark ordinance out there, that translates to review of all exterior changes to that property. And I know that you guys are familiar with this, but for those who would be watching this training later, regulating those exterior changes does not mean you can't make exterior changes, does not mean you can't make major alterations to your property. It's just that it has to go through this extra review so that the commission and the community have the opportunity to make sure that those changes are in the best interest and preserve those character defining features. Again, we just talked about the standards for rehabilitation. Those are the standards you'd use in that regulatory aspect. Usually, and for most preservation ordinances, it is not a gateway to financial incentives, unless you as a community come together to create some sort of financial incentive based on your local landmark ordinance. Then you would have that, but there is no automatic program out there. For instance, here in Buffalo, we at PBN, by the support of a national funder that does programs like this, we have a revolving loan fund that we just established last year. We're in our pilot year. We're hoping that in the future we'll be able to expand it to the rest of the county and then certainly the rest of our service area. But for right now, we're just in the city of Buffalo, where we are offering loans, low interest loans for improvements to your landmark property, or if you are willing to landmark your property, you can apply to our historic loan fund. Many other communities, not just in New York State, but around the country, have revolving loan funds like that, either run by the local nonprofit or in some instances operated by the municipality themselves, using some of that HUD or CBD, I never say the letters right because I always want to say the bar, CD, whatever, community block grants to pay for cover that loans. There is one technical financial incentive that does exist in New York State associated with local landmarking, and that is a tax abatement program. It's enabled at the state level. So the state has passed, because here in New York, we have home rule. So certain things cannot happen unless the state enables it. So the state enabled this tax abatement program for landmark properties. But to take advantage of that program, your municipality has to pass an ordinance buying into that process. And to my knowledge, as of right now, it is only the city of Buffalo that has done that in Western New York. And how that tax abatement program works is that if you can document and prove that your increased tax assessment value was directly related to your improvement and rehabilitation of your landmarked property, that you can have an abatement on that increased tax assessment, and it lasts over 10 years. So it is a phased in, you phase into that full new tax assessment value. Great financial incentive, a wonderful program, but again, you have to enable that at your local level. Just like with the National Register nomination, the survey work needed to research and prepare local nominations is an important land use tool. I heard you guys talking before we started about your spreadsheets and getting the list from the Historical Society and making sure you had knowledge of all the properties that have research. Knowing what you have and what its history is so very important, not just for your preservation decisions, but for other municipal decisions and planning and zoning decisions that might be happening in your municipality. And then the last and best part about the local landmarks and the preservation ordinances is that owner approval is not required. We read, the letter of the law of your preservation ordinance. That landmark nomination is reviewed and evaluated based on its ability to successfully meet the criteria in your ordinance. It is not based on a current or previous, it's not based on a owner's wishes or desires or whatnot. It is based on evaluating that resource and whether or not it meets the criteria and is significant and is a resource that we want to preserve. Obviously, the community, property owners, whoever is involved can voice their opinions on whether or not it should be passed, but owner approval is not required. I kind of, package this and frame this in that the same way, it speaks for the buildings because the buildings can't speak for themselves. So the buildings can't say, no, I don't want you to tear me down. This local preservation ordinance gives us the ability to pause these major decisions so we can really evaluate, are these the good decisions, not just for this resource, but for us as a community? So that's a really key distinction to understand. And then that brings us to the local certified historic district. And so this can only happen with historic districts, like we said. And so these are locally designated historic districts. So you've already gone through successfully through your process to locally designate this district. But then you're interested in National Register status. But for whatever reason, your historic district isn't eligible for the National Register. And I'll explain why that might happen. But you approach the National Park Service, you approach SHPO, and they say, no, it's not eligible. There is a possibility that you could, instead of listing it on the National Register, get it to be certified by the Secretary of the Interior. And that certification effectively means that we believe that the significance, the narrative of this historic district meets the criteria to be listed on the National Register, but we're not going to list it. But by certifying it, we're going to allow you to access historic tax credits, because historic tax credits would normally only be accessible to people listed in the National Register. Why would you want to pursue a certified local district? There's two main reasons why. One reason, and this is the reason why New York City has so many certified local districts, is because of that owner approval requirement of the National Register. If you have a district that has over 1,000 properties in it, and talking about New York City as an example, and each of those 1,000 buildings that are in your historic district each have 5 or 6 owners because they're apartment buildings, they're condos, they're interesting different ownership things. So you could have a historic district that has thousands of owners. The sheer staff time and material and postage and all of that work to do that outreach to those owners and to do that due diligence that's required in the National Register process is just astronomical and just not possible to be done. So instead of listing it on the National Register, often in New York City, they will pass it as a local level district, giving it that protection on the local level, and then get it certified so all of those owners can access historic tax credits. The other reason why you would want to pursue certified local districts, and the reason why we here in the city of Buffalo have several certified districts, is the integrity issue. So for us, the most recent certified local district that we created was the Broadway Fillmore Historic District. We did that research and came up with that narrative. It has incredible significance. The role and relationship that Broadway Fillmore neighborhood had with the development of the city of Buffalo in general is incredibly significant. The role that that neighborhood had with the history and evolution of the Polish community and then subsequent African American and Black communities. It's an incredibly historic neighborhood, but it has integrity issues. Not just on an individual building point of view, that lots of those buildings might have lost their character defining features individually, but that neighborhood has experienced a lot of loss due to disinvestment and other racist programs that used to exist, where that prioritized demolition instead of rehabilitation. So because of all of those integrity issues, we would never be able to list that district on the National Register. So then we pursue the certified route, where we get listed on at the local level and then get it certified so people can use those tax credits. So again, it's kind of that the mashing of all of the best qualities of the National Register process and the local landmarking process. And again, it cannot be done for individual resources, because if it's an individual resource, you can, easily, as long as the owner is in approval, nominate that property. It doesn't apply or isn't eligible for individual resources. And then here is just like a cheat sheet that tells you the differences of those major things that people always like to talk about or bring up. So National Register, local and certified districts, honorary designations, all of them are. They all are honorary designations saying, great job, you have significance and importance to our community. It is only the local and certified districts that have that regulatory function on a regular basis. So if you are making exterior changes to those local and certified properties, you have to get that permission or that permit, but that does not exist for the National Register. And then with financial incentives, you have access to grants and tax credits on the National Register. You have access to just tax credits on the certified level, but really don't have any financial opportunities at the local level, unfortunately. All of these processes offer multiple moments of input into government decisions. All 3 of these processes have their own number and prescribed method of public hearings. They all require it. So again, there's constant opportunity to voice your opinion on these processes. And then last, just to really nail it home, permit review exists for locally landmarked and exists for certified, because certified is a local landmark, but it does not apply to National Register nominations. Excellent. Questions about designations? You guys are so smart. This is wonderful. And I didn't eat lunch, so like this is gonna be real quick and I can eat lunch now. I got stuck in traffic coming home from the office this morning. All right, so let's talk about benefits of historic preservation. Like I was saying at the beginning of this talk, it's really easy to focus on that society, that culture circle when we're talking about historic preservation. But it is absolutely imperative to remember and to keep in, especially as you guys serving on your commission, in your official position of talking and communicating to your community about preservation, it is absolutely important that we do not lose sight of the environmental reasons for preservation and the economic reasons for preservation. Historic preservation is the most sustainable option for treating our built environment. If for those of you who have been reading and learning more about climate change and the things that we can do to try to stop it, to create a better situation that we have currently, we are not going to build our way out of that. We are not going to create new things to fix that. The most effective way to stop climate change and to try to reverse some of these negative things that are happening is by preserving what we currently have and focusing on our current resources. So let's kind of unpack all of the different benefits and reasons to do preservation. Because it is intermingled, this cute, pretty Venn diagram that I got from PowerPoint makes it seem like only a little bit is overlapping, but really these are like very much totally on top of each other. And it is kind of hard, especially when we talk about environment and economy and the financial side of it, to really separate those economic reasons and financial reasons. So we're just kind of going to talk about it all together at once through a variety of slides. First, I want to talk about this, which is the trends that we see happening with our historic built environment. This is obviously a survey that was done on the city of Buffalo, so not all of the data points that are featured in this is going to apply to Grand Island, because you are a completely different type of community than the city of Buffalo is. But the overreaching patterns and principles that that we find in this data do apply to most communities that have historic resources. In our historic older buildings, that's where we find our greater population density. So we have more people living in those older buildings than we do in our newer builds. When we look at our older buildings, we see that they're often housing more small businesses, more locally owned businesses, and especially businesses that are owned by women and minorities. So you have these historic buildings, these older buildings being the incubators for our next generation of entrepreneurs. So if we lost those buildings, we would lose those buildings that would allow for that development. And then we also see in those older buildings a higher concentration of foreign-born residents. Again, that this is that ground where our new residents coming into this country are finding their homes and their place in these older buildings and allowing them and setting the ground for their life in America. So if we lost those buildings, we don't know really how or where they would go or how we'd be able to meet that housing need. Again, obviously the nitty-gritty details of this don't necessarily apply fully to Grand Island, but those general principles do. This is what we see happening in these new buildings, in these old buildings. So wanting to preserve those buildings so that we can preserve the wonderful things that come out of these ideas. We love to talk about walkability. We love to talk about increased density. Our historic built environment gives us that already. We don't need to build new things to create density, to create walkable neighborhoods. We already have it in our existing infrastructure. We don't want to lose these older buildings that are serving as these incubators for new businesses and new citizens. We want to be able to have these locations where these people can explore and expand and make our country better, certainly. We did this study back in 2006, I want to say 2017. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has an arm of their organization that's called Preservation Green Lab. And so they came to Buffalo and partnered with us to undertake this survey. And we would not have been able to do this all on our own, certainly. All of that data points, too much for us. Historic tax credits, we're talking about an economic benefit to historic preservation. Certainly not going to get into all of the details and aspects about the historic tax credit program. There are different eligibility requirements for the homeowner credit and for the commercial income producing tax credit, but we have them. So we have a 20% state tax credit for homeowners who own and occupy National Register historic districts. So you'll be able to get a 20% credit on your qualified expenses on your property. And then for the commercial tax credit, again, if you're listed on the National Register, you might be eligible for that combined state and federal 40% credit. So 20% from the state and 20% from the federal government. So you have at least the opportunity to access those financial incentives. In addition to historic tax credits, I briefly mentioned it before, but there are several, more than several, grant opportunities that specifically mention National Register status as eligibility requirements. And so if you are a nonprofit organization, you will be able to access those if your property was listed. And for your edification, I do a monthly tax credit workshop. It's the second Wednesday of every month. Actually, next month, it's on the third Wednesday because we had a conflict. But I discuss and am available every month to talk to property owners about those tax credits. Buffalo is the largest user of homeowner and commercial, or not just Buffalo, but Western New York is the largest user of these tax credits outside of New York State, a city. So we definitely want to make sure that we educate as many people as we can about tax credits so we keep using them, because if we keep using them and they are in high demand, then we are better able to advocate to the state to expand those tax credits. I mentioned Preservation Green Lab, who helped us with that study of the city of Buffalo, but they also do tons of other studies for individual cities. Like they partnered with us to come and do that individual study for us, but then also big national studies. And so the next couple of slides are going to be from this Looking for the Greenest Building study that they did. They took comparable sized buildings, comparable in all ways, that were in 5 or 6 different locations across the country, representing different climates and other environmental conditions, and analyze their energy efficiency and all manners of greenness to evaluate whether or not preservation affects green and sustainability-ness. And so here is some facts that we discovered from that survey. As we already know in this room, historic resources are valuable, our historic buildings are valuable resources. I think that fact at the bottom there is the most in bananas number that you could think of, the fact that 1/3 of our existing buildings, 82 billion square feet, will be demolished and replaced by 2030. As preservationists, we all have to understand that sometimes buildings have to be demolished. We can repair and replace and maintain our structures and continue using them for quite a long time, but all materials have some sort of end date to their life. So we do have to understand that sometimes we may need to tear down some buildings. But the fact that we are tearing down and rebuilding so much, so often, is just such an immense waste of not just energy, but of materials on epic proportions. So that is just a very mind-blowing figure to think of. When we talk about demolishing those existing infrastructure and built environment and replacing it with new, we really need to talk about those energy that we're losing and using, and the resources that we wasted and used. So this idea of embodied energy. So that's the measurement of energy used in the process of building. So that is not just the energy you spend building this physical building, putting the beams and everything together, but it's the energy that was spent growing those trees, cutting those trees down for your lumber, creating the nails, creating the glass, every single thing that went into building that building holds that embodied energy. When you throw that building away, you waste all of that energy. It might not seem like an important thing. It might seem like this nebulous imaginary thing. Well, who cares? It's already been spent. So why can't we just get rid of it? But the more and more energy we consume and use, the more we contribute to our greenhouse gases, the more we accelerate climate change. So instead of rebuilding and wasting all this energy, we should be looking to reusing and reusing our built environment instead of rebuilding it. Another great fact, not great, but terrifying fact, if you look down at the bottom, the pictures are a little blurry. I'm sorry, I didn't realize. But you have a rehabilitated and retrofit building. You've, retained that embodied energy of the existing materials. When you're rehabbing that building, because of the nature of that rehab, you're more likely to then what materials you need. You're getting them from a local source or a close to local source, and you're using often more local labor as well. So you're spending more on labor than necessarily materials. But when you're talking about new builds, that equation is flipped, and you're spending more of your money on the materials because your materials are coming from outside of your community. You're getting new modern materials that are not made in your neighborhoods. And then because of those materials and how those new materials are constructed and put together, you're using less labor actually. So in new builds, you're spending more money on materials that's going out of your community and less on labor that would stay in your community. So that's a terrifying kind of numbers right there. But then when we actually look at the environmental impact of that energy used and lost in building that new construction, no matter how energy efficient, fancy pants, lead meeting you are in that new building, you are still in the hole energy-wise because you threw away that old building. And so for newly constructed buildings, we're talking about it taking 40 to 80 years to overcome that negative impact, to overcome the fact that you threw away that original building that was on that location. If you want to kind of, again, reference it and take it in comparison to how we talk to our children about recycling, right? We collect every empty can, every scrap of paper. We put as much as we can in that recycle box because we think that that's going to save the world, but we're literally throwing away hundreds of buildings without a second thought. We need to do more of the collecting of these buildings and saving of these buildings to really make a meaningful change in that climate change process that's happening. What's next? And so then, not just the embodied energy in the resources and that are existing and the energy that's spent to create this new building and whatnot. It's also just the energy that's used to demolish buildings, the actual gas and physical energy that's needed to remove them. And so here on the top left-hand side, you see some numbers that we came up with here for a project in the city of Buffalo at Elmwood and Forest, where they tore down 11 houses, individual 2- and 3-story, incredibly large, beautiful 19th century houses. Just the energy to demolish those buildings would, as we cutely describe in this thing, would power an electric car to go around the world 237 times, which is a lot of energy and a lot of driving. So again, all of that wasted energy so that they could just then replace it with new buildings that occupy the same exact spot. And then here you have this chart again that focuses a little bit more on that principle that we saw in the in the slide before about overcoming those energy deficits that you accrued building that new building. So each community, depending on their environmental situation and access to materials, will have different numbers, but you can still see, we would definitely be more akin to those Chicago numbers here, but an urban village mixed use building, it'll take 42 years to overcome the demolition of whatever was there and the building of the new building, and so on and so forth. The last thing I'll say from this slide is that image in the corner. It was the cover of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the ACHP, released the study in 1979, right at the, right during the energy crisis that happened in the 70s, where they assessed the energy conservation benefits of historic preservation. So again, I think a lot of people who are not fully educated or understanding of preservation and preservation policies think that we've just suddenly started talking about the role that preservation has in our environment, when actually that is not true. We have been talking about the role of preservation in energy consumption in the environment since the beginning of formal preservation here in America, since we had the Preservation Act. And the Advisory Council, the National Park Service, has been providing guidance on energy efficiency since then. I wish it had a jazzier cover, but that's another thing. So all of those things that we just discussed, we're focusing on the broader picture and the broader topics and whole buildings. But there's also the energy and financial sustainability aspect of the individual elements of a historic home and a traditional built home versus a new home. So it's incredibly important to understand that older architecture is not inefficient with energy. There's this idea that old architecture is not energy efficient, and that is incorrect. It is better to understand and explain that by realizing that our definition of energy efficiency has drastically changed since we built those traditional buildings versus our current buildings. Currently, energy efficiency means to us that we have created this, for all intensive purposes, a hermetically sealed building that we regulate its energy consumption and use with a computer. So you have your house, you have your thermostat, you get to set it whatever temperatures that you need it for your comfort, but then also to meet your money saving needs and desires, right? So you maintain that temperature all year round. That is not at all how traditional architecture was built in mind of, or how people used traditional architecture. We get to World War II and we start having more of the types of construction that we have today, and that incredibly changes. Now we are keeping buildings consistent temperatures all year round so that we are always in the temperature we want to, so we can walk around in shorts and a tank top in the middle of winter in your house. That would not be happening in pre-World War II and earlier traditional architecture. Your houses, traditional houses, were purposefully built to be drafty because we did not have air conditioning. We did not have computers to regulate our energy consumption. So we needed our traditional architecture to function first and foremost for the hottest weather. We needed that building to be able to breathe because we didn't have air conditioning. So we needed to be able to get airflow through that building. And then as far as weather stripping and retrofitting for colder temperatures, people changed. Our habits and our uses of our buildings changed. Not that we modified necessarily our building or changed and closed up things. The way that we occupied buildings and heated buildings in the past is not the same. Again, like I said, currently we heat and cool our entire house, our entire building, no matter if someone is using that space or not. That is not how traditional architecture was thought of or contrived or built. You only used energy in the space that you were occupying. People closed doors. People had, now we have big, huge, broad, open floor plan houses being built. That takes up a lot of energy to heat and cool that space. In traditional architecture, we have rooms and doors so that we can trap and control that energy so that the space that we're using can benefit from that heat. So understanding that energy efficiency definition has changed and the way that we use have changed. So it's not necessarily the building is bad and we have to change it. It's that it was just built with a completely different mindset. So to bring that traditional building up to our current mindset, we just have to do some simple modifications to control those issues and to modify those issues. Another big thing about the difference between how traditional buildings were built versus how we build and repair and maintain them now is this concept of no maintenance, right? So we have all these different materials that are available to us today to offer no maintenance. So it's very, very easy. You don't have to paint your house every year. You don't have to fix your windows anymore. You put a bunch of, shiny, bright vinyl all over your porch and you don't have to do anything to it. But it is so important to understand that no maintenance does not mean no maintenance. No maintenance means it is not repairable. Traditional architecture was built to be repaired. So we have these two pictures in front of us of people fixing windows. Our lady in the red is working on a traditional wood window. That wood window was built to be removed, taken apart, and each individual element repaired and tuned up for its best function. If you got a baseball through that window where that woman is standing, you can just replace that one pane of glass that was broken. It's made to be fixed and repaired. It's meant to be retrofitted based on temperature. So in the summertime, you're going to remove that storm window. You're going to, with the properly functioning wood window, you can lower your top sash, raise your bottom sash so you can create an airflow so that you can have the cool outside breeze come into all parts of your house. And then in the winter time, you can be able to close up both of those windows and add weather stripping so you can keep out that breeze. And certainly back in the day, people would change out their drapes to greater facilitate the prevention of drafts coming in. Because in the summertime, we don't need heavy drapes, but the wintertime, we can use those to help us maintain that temperature. Versus what we do today with the dude in the blue. Currently, windows are individual single units. You cannot fix any of those modern replacement windows. No matter how expensive or fancy a window you have purchased, you cannot fix all of those individual elements like you can with an original wood window. My favorite story to tell that makes me look like a doofus, I've been working in preservation for over 15 years now. My parents obviously are fully aware of what I do for a living and are full support of it, but they knew that I would be very upset if they replaced all of their windows, and they did so without telling me. I came home to visit them one time when I used to live in the South. I went out with some friends, had a few too many drinks, got back to my parents' house quite late, realizing that I no longer had a key to my parents' house. Empowered by copious amounts of tequila, I managed to push up this replacement window that was in the spare bedroom, and I just somersaulted into the bed and went to bed. Come to find out the next morning that I had completely shattered the entire locking mechanism for this window. And now this window would no longer ever properly lock. My parents had to buy a whole complete new unit of $600 window because I broke the lock. If you had broke the lock on that wood window, you'd go to the hardware store and buy a $5 lock and replace that lock. So again, you might be saving money in this yearly maintenance and upkeep and tuning up of your wood window, but the amount and cost of fixing and replacing a broken replacement window is just so much more astronomical cost than repairing and maintaining your current existing windows. Any questions about that? Excellent. And so here, this is the bottom line from that Preservation Green Lab study, that all of the data in that study, and I highly recommend you research, looking at it. And I apologize, I just realized I did not include it in the resources that I gave via email for you guys. So I'll definitely send that link after this program. But again, all of that data that they found showed that reusing this existing built environment is good on an economic level and an environmental level. One thing that I didn't actually really talk that much, and that's bolded in this slide here, is then that financial impact on jobs and industry otherwise. And so, as I mentioned way earlier in the presentation about the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation, every state in the country has done some sort of economic impact study about historic preservation, either the impact of historic tax credits, the impact of historic tourism, or local landmarking as well. And all of those studies, no matter what community they're in, no matter what aspect of historic preservation that they are analyzing, show the immense financial benefit of doing preservation, not just in money raised for governments through taxes and by people's own, benefit, but also by creating jobs. That jobs created in preservation are not only more jobs created compared to other types of projects, but they are jobs that last longer, because that investment in the skill of traditional trades is something that will develop into a much more lucrative, long-standing career than some of those skills and trades associated with modern construction methods. And then, oh, that's my last slide, which is still from my old presentation. I forgot to delete. So that is the end of today. I'll stop this share and see if there are any other questions that you guys have, either about the things that we talked about today or anything in general about preservation that I can answer for you guys. I thank you immensely, not only for your support of Preservation Buffalo Niagara, but for letting me and being open to doing these training sessions so that you guys are better equipped to do your best job with protecting and promoting Grand Island's resources. Any questions? And that's fine.
Thanks, Christy.
Actually, Christy, one question, just because I know you deal with this a lot. How about in terms of grant money or anything of any kind of funding for projects related to preservation? Are you familiar with anything? I mean, is it, especially when it comes to private, public-private type grants, are there any that you're familiar with?
Oh yeah, definitely. There are many state level grants, and it's a little bit difficult to like rattle all of them off right now because how the state organizes their programming. There's just that one CFA application, that one application opening maybe twice a year, and there's a whole bunch of different grants that are able to access. But there are many grants through the Preservation Office. Whether it's through the Preservation Office themselves or through, the Department of DC, all the letters. There are many different projects. So it really, grant opportunities. So it really depends on the project that you're talking about and the specifics of that project to be able to find that grant opportunity to match with it. I can and will send you, when we're done here, I have a listing that is geared for municipalities, nonprofits, and religious institutions of kind of the usual suspect grants that are available. So I mean, for instance, I'm helping a few churches who, church buildings are incredibly large and beautiful and expensive. So there are 2 different grant programs that are available for religious institutions to get funding. There is a big, huge grant program through the State Preservation Office that's called the Environmental Protection Fund grant. So it has environment in the name, but it allows for preservation projects to take that money. And you can request up to $500,000. It's a matching grant, but you would be able to use that for your brick and mortar project. We currently are pursuing funding from the state through a variety of different agencies for our project in rehabilitating 72 Sycamore Street, the Eliza Quirk House. It's at the corner of Sycamore and Michigan. And so we ourselves are going through that process of trying to find funding. But yes, there is definitely grant money out there, funding opportunities available for private public partnership type projects, definitely.
Interesting, okay. Because we're hearing that it's very difficult to get that. The projects we're looking at are kind of small though. One's a very small schoolhouse, so we're talking thousands or maybe $10,000 to $20,000. The other one's probably in that $5,000 to $7,000.
Yeah. I think that someone might have mentioned, referenced that building to me before. And one program that comes to mind right now is there are a couple of different grant opportunities through still the Parks Department that are programs that are specifically for like rail to trail type programs and, grant programs that are aimed to connect people to the natural environment. But within the description of what's eligible projects, that grant also includes and allows you to use money on brick and mortar preservation projects. So especially, if you have historic resources adjacent to natural areas and you want to turn those resources into some sort of public space, a community space that could be used in conjunction with that natural space, and then also just the general public, there might be opportunity in that grant to be able to use money for it. So there definitely is money either from the state. There are grant programs through the Preservation League of New York State. Those programs, usually they have one tiny program that kind of focuses on brick and mortar money, but they offer money for preservation planning. So if you have this church building that you would like to turn into something, but you haven't done your study on what the feasibility study or anything associated with researching what you can do with that property, you could get grant money to do that project. I think to what you just said about the difficultness of getting it, yes, there are the grants that are out there. All of them are very competitive. And when we look at the total number of grants monies that are out there and the ones that are eligible for brick and mortar preservation projects, it's obviously smaller than what might be available for other topics. So they're going to be competitive grants. But if you, as the applicant, really, really focus on putting together the most successful thing, obviously your chances will be much better than others.
Thanks, Christy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Well, then that is it. I know that we talked
Thanks
about
again.
Yeah, and we talked about doing more programs in the future. So I'll just be in touch with you guys about doing that. But if that is everything, I'm going to leave the room, but I'm going to send a follow-up email to June with a couple of the things that I mentioned that I had forgotten, and then the funding list as well.
Excellent. Good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, guys.
Because it's a public meeting, if there's nothing else to cover, just do a motion to close the meeting.
Do I have a motion to close the meeting? Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Meeting is closed.